The reception of this game has been pretty mixed so far, ranging from loving it to half decent to downright awful. I think I fall somewhere in the middle camp, as most people probably do, but that was only really by the time I reached the end. But I went into this game with a lower set of expectations, given some important context. This game began as a solo project by director Yang Bing back in 2014 when he was a graduate student. He was working on this as a passion project that caught the attention of SIE when a demo video he posted went viral. Then in 2016, he joined their support initiative, China Hero Project, and formed his own studio the following year, building a small team from scratch. Most of them were new to large-scale development, which meant that there was a lot of trial and error, scrapped systems, redone assets, and long stretches where progress seemed to halt. And as the project grew, so did its scope. And they had to pivot from a PS4 title to a PS5 release, which brought a whole new wave of technical challenges, even with the team slowly growing to a total of around 40. It's a kind of journey where the passion never really left, but you can feel the growing pains behind the scenes, with years of rework, shifting direction, and the pressure of expectations that came from being that viral game. Still, against all odds, Lost Soul Aside finally went gold this year, nearly a decade after its announcement. And so for all of that, it's worth commending, because needless to say, video game development is hard. It's not always easy to put something out there in the world, no matter what it is. Still, that doesn't mean that it should go without criticism, but the context can provide a weight of expectations, and that's what I went in with. But unfortunately, still came out relatively disappointed. At first, I was actually really enjoying it. It felt like it was filling that Final Fantasy-shaped hole that I needed this year, and that's because this game is very much Final Fantasy. And in a lot of ways, you could almost think of this as a sort of Final Fantasy 16.5, a Final Fantasy game to hold you over until the next big release. And that's because this is very obviously inspired by it and makes no effort to hide it. It is truly a love letter to the series, more specifically Final Fantasy 15, at least according to Yang Bing. Which is interesting because I can definitely tell that there's some elements of 15 baked in here, especially with the weapon system, but the game stands out as something more similar to 16 to me. I mean, of course, our main protagonist Kaiser looks like every anime protagonist ever, and thus naturally resembles Noctis from 15 as well, except if you picked him up from Temu, but in a lot of ways, I was more so reminded of Clive from Final Fantasy 16. Sure, all three of these characters don black, but what separates Noctis from Clive is that Clive is an older brother, one whose motivations stem from their younger sibling. Kaiser is the same, arguably more so, considering that the game is about saving the lost soul of your little sister. If anything, Kaiser sounds more like the brother in Nier Replicant than he does Noctis. It's funny that I mention this though, because unlike the deeper development and relationship between Clive and Joshua and the brother and his sister, Kaiser's relationship with Louisa is incredibly surface level, past the few fleeting conversations and memories we see, where nothing particularly interesting happens that develops either of them. In fact, I'd say that the story and the characters and their dynamics as a whole is pretty surface level and underbaked. I mean, I think it has generally a decent skeletal structure, which you'll come to see really that's how I feel about the game as a whole, but it mostly feels super generic and lacking really any sort of interesting complexity. In some ways, that's fine, and it's serviceable, and you might be okay with something like that, and that's fine. In fact, I myself didn't mind that it was simple, because I was looking for something to have fun with more so than anything particularly complex at that specific point in time. It's definitely one of those things where it just dropped at the right moment, and had it dropped at any other, I might have felt a lot more differently about this game. That being said, this is a review after all, so I can't say that I recommend it at this price point. I think if it were priced at $40 instead of 60 or 55 Canadian instead of 80, then I think we'd be having an entirely different conversation and the reception probably would be looking a lot more positive. A little context as to what the story is even about in case you don't know. The game is set in a high fantasy, sci-fi hybrid world where an authoritarian empire, because there's always an empire, exerts control across the land of Celestria and beyond. Amid this imperial order, terrible rifts open between dimensions, and mysterious invaders known as the Voidrax appear, stealing souls and threatening the world's very balance. That's when Kaiser and his younger sister Louisa, orphaned by war, join a resistance group called Glimmer. Yeah, pretty much Avalanche without any snow, to stand up against the Empire. During a major Imperial celebration, the Voidrax launch an attack. Kaiser then falls into an underground lab where he meets a massive dragon-like Voidrax named Lord Arena, and merges with his essence that for some reason often gets confused for a flying fish.
This flying fish can talk?
Gaining extraordinary power. Souls are ripped from people, chaos erupts, and Louisa's soul is stolen. And with the Empire and the Voidrax threat looming, Kaiser, with Arena's help, embarks on a quest to rescue Louisa's soul, gather mystical soul crystal fragments, traverse alternate dimensions, and face the ultimate Voidrax leader, whose goal is to reshape reality itself. Now, I do sound harsher towards the story than I actually feel though, because there are some things even with this incredibly generic plot and characters that I actually did enjoy. More specifically, the relationship between Kaiser and Arena, which is actually pretty well developed. I mean, it's not as deep as Joel and Ellie, or Kratos and Atreus, or even Booker and Elizabeth, but it's decent. Though I guess that comes with the territory of being the type of companion that sticks by your side through the duration of your playthrough. And to be honest, most of that heavy lifting is done by Arena, because Kaiser on the other hand, unfortunately, has the personality of a wooden spoon. As for the other characters, you do spend some time with them, and there is some banter here and there, but these relationships with them never really go anywhere. And by that, I don't necessarily mean romantically, just even more generally speaking. Yet we still get more development with even them than we do with Louisa. Voice acting, a lot of people seem to hate, and I don't blame them, especially with, whatever this is supposed to be. But aside from that, I don't really think that the voice acting is really that bad. It's not good, let's be clear, but it's certainly not the worst I've heard either. Maybe it's because I went into it with an entirely different set of expectations than everyone else, but it is more or less what I expected from it. But again, I am also typically more forgiving towards voice acting than most, because I don't typically cringe at listening to anime dubs. But to be fair, some characters are better voiced than others, but they're not amazing either. Again though, I think this would have been something more overlooked if the price was much lower, because the quality here is not that of a near AAA game. Though, to be fair, it is priced slightly cheaper than a AAA game is, which is kinda sad when you think about it, because that's what the standard price of AAA used to be just a few years ago. As much as I dug the combat, it took me a long while before I finally adjusted to the dodge button. I probably spent like at least a third of the game with my finger defaulting to L1 to block instead of circle, or circle to dodge instead of L1, and it often ruined the flow. This isn't a huge deal because it is something that you can get used to, and perhaps maybe some others may prefer it this way, I don't know. But from my experience, modern design language often dictates that the other design format is more intuitive. But fine, if you're not going to follow more common control types, at least include the option to swap to different ones if not allowing for full remappability, which, to be honest, is something that I wish all games had these days. Apart from those two buttons, however, the placement of the rest was as expected. Still, it would be really nice to see more games implementing custom control schemes. That aside, and the Lost Souls, the game does take notes from 15 in its weapon system. Starting the game with a standard sword, you progress through eventually unlocking a greatsword, a pole blade, and then finally a scythe, all of which can be easily swapped to via the D-pad, if you're playing on controller like I did. And it's actually really fun to swap between them, using different weapon types for different enemies, figuring out which type is most effective on which enemy at that given moment. So for example, you could swing your enemies in the air with your scythe, swap to your pole blade to shoot magic, and then pummel them down with your greatsword. It not only makes the core gameplay loop more fun, but it adds versatility and a good level of challenge. In addition to this, you can also upgrade your weapons by adding weapon accessories that you can either buy or find in loot to your weapon of choice to boost stats. You can also place and resize them anywhere along the sword to help customize it. Difficulty cannot be changed through the menu or even at the start of the game. It is one uniform level until you've beaten it, at which point you can unlock the harder mode. This is something to be aware of in case you might have considered playing this on an easier mode and aren't that well versed into this style of game. Now, I don't think that the difficulty is particularly hard even on the standard mode, but it does become somewhat monotonous and tedious after a while. I think it's important to play a balancing act of having combat that's fun, fast, and fluid, while also not being overbearing. Because even with a changing combat style as you progress through, when it feels like wave after wave of spongy enemies that seemingly never cease and your hand starts to cramp, the fun starts to dissipate. And part of it might have also been the enemy variety. I mean, there are various types, but I felt like they all started to feel the same after a while. As for the boss fights, again, I really enjoyed them at first. There's a few memorable fights that I feel like that once you've come out on the other end, you feel really strong and victorious, and it feels pretty rewarding and satisfying. But as we approach the end of the game, like the enemies and the rest of the combat, it starts to feel just as flat and monotonous after a while, and you start to grow more interested in just trying to reach the end. It's thankfully not so much of a slog that it was super difficult to get through, though had it been any longer, it might have, but you can definitely see the stark contrast from the start of the game to the end. Like the weapons, you can upgrade yours and arena skills too. You can do this by gathering Voidrax crystal shards that you can find by either opening chests or defeating enemies. You can then exchange them for skill points and then dump them into certain abilities. This did add an extra layer to the combat to spruce things up a little bit, but even then I feel like that can only go so far. Because even though it makes for a satisfying attack, doing significant damage, because they're so spongy, you become more and more reliant on these abilities just to rush through, and that's not fun either. By visiting a female version of Chadley from Final Fantasy VII, except not nearly as annoying as him, named Liana, you can save, use her workshop to craft potions and weapons, visit her shop to purchase consumables and other materials, use her battle simulation, just like Chadley, visit the dispersed dimension for challenges and boss rushes, transmog your weapons, and change your appearance, though the options here are pretty limited. The world itself is beautifully designed. It is a very visually stunning game, especially when in combat. And as big and as expansive as it all looks, don't be fooled by the spectacle, because this is a very linear game with decently sized hub worlds. It's even more linear than something like the new God of War games too. But that doesn't make it necessarily a bad thing, because it's not like it feels super barren either. It's quite nicely contained, and had it been any bigger, I think it actually would have been to its detriment, because I think that the level design here is actually pretty good. And it's nothing groundbreaking, but it flows pretty well. Performance, however, does not. Or at least not at launch. Many people have reported bugs, including frame drops, stuttering, crashes, and a spattering of all sorts of issues, but most of those issues were on PC. On PS5, it runs somewhat decently, but even then, there's been a number of reports of players experiencing issues on there too. Playing on the PS5 Pro, however, it ran perfectly fine. During my time, I had no noticeable dips or stutters, and it ran at a smooth 60 FPS the entire time. I haven't touched the game since launch though, but there have been updates and patches, which I'll include in the description for you to check out. But I've also heard even some of those need some ironing out. As for Xbox fans though, you will have to sit this one out unfortunately, as this was only developed for PS5 and PC. So in the end, Lost Soul Aside feels like a game that consistently wrestles with its own ambition. It's gorgeous, flashy, and fun in bursts, but also repetitive, uneven, and never really quite reaches the emotional or narrative depth that it aims for. You can see that there's heart behind it. You can feel that this was someone's dream project. But sometimes passion alone isn't enough to carry a game all the way. If you go in expecting a mid-budget, stylish action RPG inspired by Final Fantasy and Devil May Cry, you might find enough here to enjoy. But if you sought something deeper, something that really hits on the same level as its inspirations, you won't find it here. Still, for what it is, a small team's first major release that started as a student's passion project, Lost Soul Aside is okay in its own right. I just wish that the soul behind it shined a little brighter.